dear IDS participants, dear colleagues and dear guests. It's a great pleasure for me as well as for Chloé Brière, professor in EU law, who's the co-organizer of the conference, to welcome you at ULB today. This is the second edition of our conference on interdisciplinary European advanced studies. And for the second time, IDEAS is taking place under the aegis of our Jean Monnet Center of Excellence EU Qualis, which focuses on the role of the European Union in fighting inequality. Since 2022, EU Qualis has catalyzed a range of activities, of course research, and we have an edited volume stemming from the first edition of IDEAS, who will be coming out soon with Routledge. But EU Qualis is also about teaching and dissemination, including guest lectures, law clinics, surveys, and student activities on the topic of the EU and inequality. The pursuit of justice, equality, and social cohesion remains a tough challenge across the continent, and this is reflected in figures that remain unacceptably high for a region as prosperous as Europe. For instance, in 2022, 95.3 million of European citizens, that is approximately 21% of the population of the EU, were at risk of poverty and social exclusion. And according to a recent UNICEF report, approximately 20 million children, that is 1 in 4 in the EU, are threatened by poverty, alongside deteriorating mental health and online sexual abuse and exposure to pollution. But of course, beyond the core issues of income and welfare, our vision of inequality has expanded and has become multifaceted. As European societies have become increasingly diverse from the point of view of values, but also lifestyles, inequality and discriminations have come to the fore. And furthermore, our understanding of inequality has also become more transnational, owing to the opening of the boundaries of welfare, to quote Maurizio Ferreira, but also due to shared problems such as demographic aging, digitalization, or the green transition. So in the face of these challenges, is the EU living up to the expectations of citizens, but also the expectations that European leaders have set from themselves in the EU treaties, for instance? The purpose of IDEAS is to give us an opportunity to exchange, starting today and until Friday, on these questions. So we're gathering here over 50 political scientists and lawyers from Europe and beyond to share their cutting-edge research. And we will also have the opportunity to exchange with decision makers and representatives of civil society with our policy panel tomorrow at 4:30, organized by the Foundation of European Progressive Studies, FEPS. And the panel is dedicated to the topic of affordable housing. But for now, I'm truly delighted to have two distinguished colleagues with us who accepted our invitation to give the keynote to this conference. On my right, Martin Seeleib-Kaiser is Professor of Comparative Public Policy at the Eberhard Karls Universität Tübingen in Germany. Previous appointments include positions at Bremen University, Duke University in North Carolina, and the University of Oxford from 2004 to 2017. Martin is a renowned expert of the comparative study of the welfare state, including in its relations with globalization, EU integration, and citizenship. He has published an impressive number of books and articles on these topics, and Martin will open the floor and provide his perspective on social citizenship. On my left, we have Professor Zoe Lefkofridi, who is University Professor for Politics, Gender, Diversity and Equality at the Paris-Lodron University of Salzburg in Austria. She was previously affiliated with the University of Vienna, Stanford University, and the European University Institute. Zoe's research on transnational democracy, equality, and representation in Europe, as well as political parties and elections, has also been extensively published internationally. And today she will speak about democracy and gender equality in times of backlash. Alongside with ULB, the universities of Tübingen and Salzburg are members of the CIVIS, one of the European University Alliances funded by the Erasmus Plus program. CIVIS was launched in 2019, and it has grown today to a network of 11 universities across Europe who have gathered with a joint commitment that higher education has an important role to play in civic life and citizenship. This keynote is a CIVIS event, and I therefore would like to thank the CIVIS team for supporting this panel. Chloé, Martin, many thanks for accepting this invitation to share your insights and shedding different and complementing lights on the important topic of European citizenship in this twofold keynote session. And please, Martin, the floor is yours for about 25 minutes. 25. Yes.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and apologies to all of you that you had a longer coffee break because my travels were delayed from coming from Italy. Now, what I'm going to do today is not actually present you a real keynote. What I'm going to do is present you some ideas. And because I know, I've looked at the various panels, you are the experts on citizenship. There are so many kind of talks, and you know so much more. And, it's not necessarily my research, collaborative research with some other people. First, I'm going to talk about some theory, concepts, and context, present the key argument, and then provide a bit of data. And that will be almost fun, hopefully. Okay, so citizenship, right? It's a status, and we all know, it's a triad of rights: civil, political, social rights. And social rights are really important also in the European Union to fully participate, right? Because without social rights, we all know from T.H. Marshall, it is really hard. If you're hungry, going to vote for a European election, you don't go to vote. So you need something in your stomach, right? And as Lord Dahrendorf, the founder of sociology at the CIVIS University, Tübingen, in the 1960s, who later became a commissioner and then went to the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, argued that social rights are the final stone in the arc which holds up citizenship. So basically, the top stone, right? Okay. Now, if we look at citizenship in the European Union, formerly Maastricht Treaty, no one knows it. Social dimension was on the back seat. Many people have, commented on that. Then came Jean-Claude Juncker, more recently, and there are great articles on that in terms of the speeches that he gave and how actually social dimension increased. And some observers even speak of a paradigm shift afterwards, with Juncker, von der Leyen, minimum wage directive, recommendation on minimum wage, and many other kind of things. So the world is good, is it? Okay. So, and the nation state very often is perceived to be the ideal place for social policies and social rights, right? Because, and we're here in Brussels, and that's Van den Broeke Frank is obviously a minister here in this country, and he sees the EU more as a holding environment that might set some kind of minimum standards, but the reference is always the nation state and not the EU. And I would argue that is not necessarily the future, but that is, we'll see. Okay, so if we look at social rights, freedom of movement. Usually in terms of social rights, when people move, everyone knows that, and there are a couple of talks here at this event. People talk about welfare magnetism, but what actually is not very often highlighted by our politicians and our leaders is European social citizenship, right? So it's not actually defended, right? So actually, if you look at especially conservative parties, but also some social democratic parties, especially in the north of Europe, that see this as, we need to be really restrictive. However, we do have a great. European Union is really great. A Charter of Fundamental Rights. Fundamental rights, but only when implementing EU law, not national law, right? So, implementing EU law. And then we have very limited territorial redistribution. We had long debates about that, whether, the transfer union, unemployment reinsurance, whatever, still very limited. There have been some changes, I do recognize that. Okay. And the key argument here is that my argument is social rights of EU migrant citizens are highly stratified and remain unaffected by EU minimum, right? Unaffected. And social rights vary significantly within nation states and among nation states, thereby questioning the whole concept of a European social union, because the European social union assumes that nation states are homogeneous, more or less, right? Because there is solidarity, and that's why we have the nation state. We can't do it in Europe. What I'm going to show you, this is an ideal or almost a fantasy, perhaps. Okay, so all of you who are talking about, people moving, know that actually it's about those economically inactive, mostly job seekers that are the issue of many policymakers. Here is a chart that I did with Cecilia some years ago, Cecilia Pucelius. Actually, these are the people, the problematic people that, in terms of political terms, right? So the job seekers coming from elsewhere, not finding a job, becoming we don't care about the homelessness that much, but we care about that they don't get access to social assistance. Okay, so what is the problem then? Because the EU, we all know, is really, really good in setting legal frameworks, right? Because there is social security coordination. Why is there a problem then? Okay, so the problem is, and this is nation state data for you for the first. Okay, so we disposable income per capita by member states. So taking into account purchasing power. So we have, some countries that are rich, and the yellow, some countries are poor. Okay, because some countries are rich and some countries are poor, and mostly in Central and Eastern Europe, what we have, and Cecilia will remember this chart. This is an updated chart. I had some. No, this is new. I had it recalculated, right? Because has been no change in the last 10 years between who can move and who cannot move. Okay, so the older people among you, you still will remember a road atlas, right? So you travel from country A or from city A to city B, and you will have the distance. Now, what we did here is, you have the countries of origin, for example, Denmark, and you are unemployed in Denmark, freedom of movement in the European Union, you export your unemployment benefits, and you are 388 euros better off than the unemployed in Romania. So that would be the true welfare tourist would go from Denmark to Romania. Now, if a Romanian would come and look for a job in Denmark, he would be 388 euros a week worse off than the Danish, right? Because he only had, or she would only have something like 27 euros to export, right? So we actually create this inequality by social security coordination. You can see with the colors, it might work in the West, but doesn't work for the East. And that has not changed in the last 20 years, basically. And then you can do that for the pensioners as well. Right? This is kind of absolute net differences in non-means tested old age pension expenditure. Denmark looks really bad, but it's because the EU changed the accounting of labor market pensions, which are employer-provided occupational collective bargaining. They are no longer in the statutory one. That's why the statistics change. So, not so nice. Then we look at where do the people come from. This is 21, or where did they go to? Okay, so they don't go to Central and Eastern Europe. They go to Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. If you look at absolute numbers, this country is probably the most important one if you look at the absolute numbers, not in proportion. So, as I've just shown, that if you're from Romania, which is this red line, right? So in 2000, almost no one came from Romania, and this is looking at stock, because flows is really difficult to assess in the European Union, how many people are moving in and out, many people are not registered. So this actually takes only into account those who are resident in Germany, okay, at a specific point in time. And you see almost nothing, because Germany had these transitional, and these are the ones that are actually moving. So actually, and then you see this green line is Poland, Croatia, and the blue line is Bulgaria. Here, historically, the Italians in Germany, because of the guest worker program, these are largely people who have not become German citizens, but have stayed Italian citizens. So what we see is that actually it doesn't work in this union. We need to really think about what we do in order to protect those people who are moving from Central Eastern Europe to Western Europe to find jobs. Because even if, and I recommend to any one of you to try that, get your U1 form and then go to the labor market office in the country of destination and try to get your unemployment benefit. So we need to assume that everything runs smoothly, which in reality we know doesn't. So, but then we could also look at Spain, Romanian workers. We can look at Italy, Romanian workers. These are all disentitled by the existing social security coordination that we have in the European Union, because they cannot actually export substantive benefits. Okay, but that is the argument I've already made. We have made a long time ago, but just because I wanted to see whether something has changed, right? Because there was this paradigm shift, but the paradigm shift has not affected these people, right? So it's is the fundamental right to free movement only there for people from Western Europe, or for all? Question. Now, the new part of my presentation is we talk about all these policy changes, directives and stuff like that, and we talk about the lack of legitimacy. Amandine has mentioned the degree of poverty in the European Union. But poverty in the European Union, as I will show in a minute, or emphasize in a minute, is usually measured against national median income and not against the European median income. And that is something we might want to consider. So, first, I think we could look at some indicators, so at income inequality across countries and regions. And because, if whole countries are poor in the European Union, we might have a social policy issue. If people don't have employment opportunities, especially if we look at gender and employment, in whole sectors, despite all the measures that we have at the European Union, actually are not achieved, right? And then, for that, I only have the example of two countries, social services, childcare provision, how that regionally differs within countries, okay? And building on Fritz Scharpf, it's all about outcome legitimacy, right? It's actually, we're not interested that much in what governments, or politicians say, perhaps that as well, but actually, Helmut Kohl put it to the test, right? It's really important. The outcome is really important. Yeah, you didn't like Helmut Kohl, did you? Okay, so the outcome is important. Okay, so here we see disposable income per capita in member states. We see rich member states and poor member states. Now this is the, world of Frank van den Broek, and I know because he is here that I need to stress that. So this is the holding environment, right? So we have rich countries, poor countries, and we need... Okay, now, if we put it at the regional level, the whole thing collapses. This is disposable income per capita by region. Okay, then we see that in Portugal, Germany, there's East Germany, then here's Austria, quite rich. But I don't know. Is that Vienna? Which is no, can't be. And northern Italy, where I just come from, really rich, right? It is. What does it mean to be a nation state if you have these intra-nation state inequalities, regional inequalities, and then we see some capital cities in Central Eastern Europe that are as rich as West Germany. Okay, what does it mean for social citizenship? These huge inequalities, this dark blue is almost twice the income of the other countries. Okay. Now, then we can look at Disposable, these were absolute figures. Disposable income as a percentage of EU mean, right? So we actually benchmark against the European Union. Okay, and you will see these people here are not rich, not only rich, but as I will show later, they're also lazy, right? However, you know, again, this looks at the nation-state level, and it looks totally different again. You know, Southwest Germany, Baden-Württemberg, Bayern. Then you have poor people there, and then you have, you know, again, capital cities. And here it's 120% of EU mean, right? So really, and here, but what does it mean to be a nation state and a holding environment for national welfare states if we have these inequalities? Now, Amandine mentioned poverty. This is using national median income, right? So, southern Italy, then in Germany you have pockets of deep poverty, right? Deep, really deep poverty because national median. Okay. Now, back there is Dominic. And Dominic, I asked Dominic, can't we do the European median? The European median, not the national median, but a European median. Okay, so we had difficulties. We needed to should have done it earlier because you need to go to Eurostat in person and, you know, there are data protection issues. So Dominic, based on the data that is publicly available, did this. Okay, so here we have countries, and it's only possible at the country level. Here we have countries, if we take the EU median, which basically have no poverty. And then we have countries which have 70 or 80% poverty. So this more or less looks like the United States with having Mississippi and Louisiana, right? Really poor states. But this is the European, this is social Europe. If we would take the same way of measuring income inequality and poverty as we do in a nation state. And that is something we really need to consider. It also in terms of for the countries that are here in the center, and you know, if you do that on a regional basis, you get, you know, it will look different, and you know, you will down here you probably have 0, and up there you have 3 or 4% poverty or something like that, but never the 70 there. Now, if we look at employment rates, you know, I said lazy, but I'm going to get to that. Here it seems that as they are hard working, right? So it's employment rate, overall employment rate, 75% working in the southwest here, and parts of Sweden, Netherlands, hard-working people, and Belgium. Here, you know, as we know, you know, not working so hard, do they? Okay. Quickly running through female employment rate, but this is also opportunities. Look how, you know, the low the employment rate of women is in the south of Europe, largely in South and in regions, right? Meaning that here, if we talk about opportunity, and social Europe also about opportunity, and social rights about opportunity for men and women, we have some issues. No issues in Madrid necessarily, but down here, Italy, you know, this is the social democratic heartland in light blue, right? Not as dark as down there. Male employment rate also varies. Now, unemployment rate, you see similar kind of, it's again regionals, right? Look at France. Here we have some patterns. Poland, almost, you know, really low unemployment rate, below 5%. Looks very similar. Female unemployment rate. Spain. Right? These are the issues that we need to think about when we think about the social Europe. And how can we deal with them from a European perspective? What do we need to do? Right? Male unemployment rate, hours worked. Okay, so here we have the dark blue. These are the lazy Europeans because they work less than 1,500 hours. Right? The Danes, the Germans, the Dutch. Those who work in Greece work more than 1,900 hours, right? So actually, few people working here, but those who work long hours. Here, many people work short hours with the highest income, 120% of. we need to keep that in mind. How many minutes? 5, 10?
10.
10. Okay. I can go slower then. Okay, so here we look at childcare.
7.
7. Okay. Childcare. Okay, this is the old picture of Germany 2007. West Germany, East Germany. The darker it is, the more childcare there is for kids up to the age of 2. And this is all-day childcare, right? So, which is the most lacking provision in many countries. And here we see 2019, but we see that also within regions there are significant, huge differences in terms of provision. Okay, this is, the darker it is, here the dark purple is more than 40% and this yellow is 1%. Okay. But this is not the only country, but only one other country that I could get data on quickly was Spain. And here we see Madrid coverage above 60%. Here it's below 30%. So what does it mean when we have a child guarantee? Right? Really mean. And I could do that with youth unemployment as well, with a youth guarantee. And because the employment figures would be very similar to the overall unemployment and figures and the figures that I've shown by gender. So where does it lead us to? Okay, first of all, for those who are mobile migrating, it's hugely still stratified rights. And all the measures that we have seen have no impact on those, despite the fact that these are usually 50% of the homeless people in cities like Brussels, Berlin, right? These are mobile EU citizens that do not have access to social assistance and therefore very often do not have access even to temporary shelter and stuff like that. Okay, nothing happened because we want nothing to happen, because although these people, we are here in Brussels, perhaps I could, if you add up the total number, how many do you think it would be? People that don't hold the nationality. Well, it's kind of the equivalent of 2 member states, the Netherlands and Sweden combined, right? It's about 17 million people. And most of them are Central and Eastern European in the meantime. Okay. Okay. Social rights, well, based on outcomes, they don't respect national boundaries, right? We experience social rights at the regional, local level. And that is also something which we need to consider politically when we talk about European elections, national elections. That is what people actually experience in their local, and that's how they perhaps vote. The stark regional differences and the concept of national welfare states, I think we really need to move beyond that. The question is, it's a political question, right? So I see my friend nodding. Yeah, he might agree, and we probably agree that politically getting there is the most difficult one, right? So, and when we look at Europe as a whole and use the European median, actually very much looks like the United States. However, we as good Europeans talk about the European social model, the European social union. We are different. We have a democracy and social rights. Do we? What kind of social rights are there? Right? If we talk about Europe. Right? Because we only talk about nation states within Europe. But then, if we talk about nation states within Europe, why do we need European citizenship? What's the concept of citizenship? This concept of citizenship is being a member of a community. And it's having a common benchmark, right? The prevailing kind of standard of living. And the prevailing standard of living, if we look at that, we have still some issues to tackle in terms of upward convergence of regions. But then there might also be a kind of an environmental issue, which we're not going to get into here. Okay. I think these huge differences undermine the legitimacy not only of nation states but of the EU. And this is the positive note. I think we really need to fight that in the future for European social concept of European social citizenship based on EU standards for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. And for sure, when our friend Frank van den Broek is no longer a minister in a few months, we'll invite him to respond to the multiple attacks that we've witnessed today. But now I'd like to give the floor. You're going to switch seats.
So thank you very much for inviting me. So I will have a different perspective and talk about the backlash against gender equality. And how does this connect to democracy, and what can we do about it? I will start with a quote by Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, who declared that the 21st century would be the century of women's equality. And then came the pandemic, and we had a very different picture about what this century would be about. We saw, of course, we had a lot of progress. We heard about citizenship. Women used to be non-citizens back in the day. So we have made a lot of progress, but we never reached parity. We never saw parliaments that were half female, half male. We didn't see that many cabinets, we didn't see that many female prime ministers, and then came the pandemic. That actually reinforced a phenomenon that I will be talking about today, the anti-gender backlash. We saw with the pandemic that actually there was a higher exposure in the so-called feminine jobs, the traditional feminine jobs, higher exposure to the virus. And we also saw that there was an unequal provision of care and emotional labor. So in a way, it was good that all this was very salient and highlighted, but it was also very obvious that there was inequality. And we also saw that there was a regression in terms of attitudes towards gender roles. So now, how the EU responded to this, you will hear tomorrow from Mathilde Seron, also from Salzburg. But I will be talking about what the backlash is and why it matters and how we could fight against it. So I will talk a little bit about what the definition, what I understand by backlash. I will talk about a project that I coordinate called the Push Backlash and its context, which is intersectional feminism. And then we'll present some preliminary findings from 2 working packages in this project. So what is the backlash? If you look at the dictionary, you will see that it's a strongly negative reaction by a large number of people to something that has changed in society recently. And you see the interchange, they alternate between backlash and resistance, so it's more or less the same. And it always has to do with social change. And interestingly, when you look at the examples that the dictionary give, it's almost always backlash against feminism, backlash against gender equality. So that's the typical example that the dictionaries would give you. So how we understand the backlash, the anti-gender backlash, is opposition, resistance to gender equality and feminism. But it's not, although it is an element of our zeitgeist, it's not something completely new. It has existed before. For example, we heard about social citizenship, and it is connected, of course, to political rights and political citizenship, which was not something women enjoyed. So the first wave of feminism was about the suffrage, about getting voting rights, about being able to participate. And as women were getting more rights, there was at the same time opposition by conservative groups because they thought that this this development, the political rights would lead to destruction of society, and because the family roles of women would be undermined and they would change. So there was opposition. Then another interesting example is after the World War. So when the war was going on, men were on the front getting killed, and women were in the country in their place. So they would work. They had taken the men's role in society. Then some of the men came back, and women were pushed back to this homemaking role. And that was also a backlash, because they had shown that they can have a different role successfully, and they were pushed back to the previous one. And that was like social expectations, but also a lot of media portrayals that were expecting women to go back to the previous role. Then in the second wave, during the second wave of feminism, which also challenged a lot social norms, you had a lot of, in various spheres of society, you had gender equality, not only the workplace, but also reproductive rights. And then you also had opposition by those that perceived this as threatening. So it's not something completely new. Today, however, we see that there is opposition to the reproductive rights, like abortion. We see it also in the EU. We saw it in Poland. Also against sexuality education in schools, not only here in Europe, but also in the US, very strongly. We see resistance against the advancement of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer people, and against laws and policies that tackle hate speech and discrimination. And we also see opposition towards gender studies, the field that tries to understand inequalities and the mechanisms that actually create it. In order to be able to solve it, we have to understand it first. But what motivates it? I mean, the key factor is fear of change. People are scared of change, the power shifts, the different dynamics, but also there are economic factors. So if more and more women come into the labor market, then some men perceive this as fewer opportunities for them and loss of status. There are also cultural and religious factors. So this perception that feminist movements are undermining family structures, so that they are a threat to the development of families. And we know that the backlash is fueled by lack of information, lack of knowledge, and misconceptions. Now, there are a lot of different forms of backlash. Some are more passive than others. There is denial. Okay, the problem does not exist. Disavowal, it exists, but it's not my responsibility. Inaction, I don't do anything about it. Appeasement, appropriation, co-option, or repression. So like more hardcore forms of backlash. And I would like to give you some examples so that you can see and identify it also in the reality around you. So we see efforts to reframe public debates about women's rights by generating fear and creating panic about the family or the nation and the role of women in saving the nation. Then we also see attempts to water down commitments and key institutions and to sideline the gender equality agenda. So it's not so important, or we hear, that everything has been achieved. We don't need to do anything else, and it's not anymore a key policy objective. And another strategy is to strip feminists and gender studies, the university programs, from legitimacy and authority. So they're not scientific enough, they're ideological. Although, also the previous keynote could also be considered ideological, and in my view, all kind of research has some kind of ideological basis. Like when we study democracy, for example, we do have a preference for a specific type of regime. So I think that it's true for every research question. It has some kind of ideological motivation, and of course gender equality has to do with gender justice. So we have attempts to reduce the space where feminists and women rights activists are operating and organizations. But why should we care? Why should we care about this phenomenon? Because today, I mean, maybe not at the origins of democracy, but in representative democracy today, in modern times, in contemporary times, gender equality is a precondition, because democracy is the only political system that is founded on the principle of equality, political equality. And it's also, gender equality is also a precondition for sustainable development. I mean, maybe you know that it's the fifth goal of the Sustainable Development Goal Agenda of the UN, but it is also, in the words of Guterres again, it's the precondition for all other, it's the prerequisite for all other goals, because how can you develop in a sustainable manner when you are denying half the population of this planet equal rights? So, because we were very interested in this phenomenon and it's wanted to understand its causes and consequences and how can we actually fight against it, I built a consortium and we applied for funding, European Union funding, and we were successful. So I'm the coordinator of this consortium. We are 11 partners from 8 countries. Not an easy job, I can tell you. Also because when we had to sign the grant agreement, we had Brexit happening. So it was a huge mess. And our goals are to systematically inquire into this contestation of the present day of gender issues. And when I say systematically, I mean using the comparative method and also using mixed methodologies. So we have surveys, we have ethnographies, we have interviews, we have theater projects, we have many different ways of studying it. And we're looking at citizens, we're looking at elites, political elites, and we're looking at social media. And after we understand, because we are in the middle of it, the goal is to develop also strategies about how to counteract this backlash effectively. So the objectives are 5. We're very ambitious, as you see. And there are different types of objectives. Some are more theoretical, others are more empirical. So to engender democratic theory from an intersectional perspective, so basically to understand also what feminist theory has done to democratic theory, how it has enriched our frameworks in order to analyze democracy. Then to understand anti-gender strategies and to assess their effects, and to identify the best strategies, so good practices to counteract the anti-gender discourses. So this is what I will be talking about later on. And based on this, we want to develop solution, because also the research that is funded by the Commission is always with policy in mind. And I think that's a good thing, that we are also challenged to think in terms of, okay, what does the knowledge we produce, what does it bring actually to policymakers? So we also need to develop solutions, recommendations, and tools, and to co-create and disseminate knowledge for gender equality. So we have several dissemination strategies. We create policy briefs for politicians, reports for researchers, infographics like the green one for the general population, and cartoons like the first one for schools. We want to also find ways of talking to kids. And this is now the the visual of the madness. So this is the project. We have a lot of different working packages. As I said, we have theoretical packages, we have empirical packages looking at political elites, then social media, then the intersectional inequalities, then we have experiments testing effects, we have theater. I will be talking actually today about outputs of the first working package and the seventh, which are the pushback strategies. But I just wanted to show you what we're doing. And these are my colleagues who have led the reports on which I will be drawing from the Technical University of Dresden and the Gender 5+ here in Brussels. Great teams, great colleagues. And so our starting point is the concept of intersectionality, and I chose this two working packages for the discussion today because I think that when we're looking at social citizenship, it will also be very interesting to look at these intersections. So our argument is that the backlash is intersectional. So there are different kind of oppressions that are intersecting with each other. This is a concept that comes originally from Black feminism, and it was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar. With this approach, we can see that racism, sexism, class exploitation, and other similar systems of oppression, they are interconnected. They're not separate. They actually are constituting each other. They're mutually constructing each other. So they are interacting. And then as a result, configurations of social inequalities that concern the discussion of Martin's keynote emerge at the junction of intersecting oppression. So how we perceive the problem depends on where we are located and what is our position in this power structure. So we have to also keep in mind that depending upon this position and our membership in different categories that intersect, we will have different viewpoints. So this is what is called intersectional feminism, that acknowledges this interconnected nature. So if you look at poverty, for example, you would also look at how is this a product of intersections between gender, because there is a lot of work about poverty being female, right? You also showed us the employment percentages, intersection between gender and race or ethnicity, class, religion, but also disability. And I would like to focus a little bit on disability, which is the most marginalized and the most invisible of all these categories. And this is my other partner from the consortium, Magda Zarota, who is a disability expert and co-founder of Humanity in Action. It's very interesting because when we also think, of these people moving to other countries, and their conditions, when we were signing the grant agreement, Magda she had disappeared, and we were trying to reach her, and you know how strict the commission is with these things. But Magda's organization was supporting disabled refugees from Ukraine. And that was her priority. And the commission waited. Because, it's Humanity in Action. So with Magda, we are trying to have, the disability perspective in wherever possible, in everything we do. And disability studies is a subfield that emerged in the 70s out of American and British disabled people's movement. And they're trying to also, the key goal is to view disabled people not just as object of research, but also as subjects. And the first professor of disability studies was in 1983. And that was a key moment for disability, for disabled people, because he created the social model of disability, which was in opposition to the until then dominant model of medical model of disability, which was based on impairment and deficit. So what does the social model of disability do? Its roots are in the union of the physically impaired against segregation. So obviously, disabled people had been irritated by this segregation and isolation, and they were thinking, of how can we change that. So this model is undermining this link, the causal link between impairment and disability. So impairment is defined as lacking all or part of a limb or having a defective limb, organism, or mechanism of the body. And disability is defined as the disadvantage or restriction of activity caused by a contemporary social organization. And this has influenced disability studies worldwide. It has influenced the way the UN understands disability and their work on advancing the rights of persons with disability. And I have here a quote. I will breathe a bit and let you read it. I think it's very beautiful about a disabled person and how this person was influenced by this model. And I think that this connects as well to the previous concept. So if this is actually, created by a society, it can also be uncreated. So it's a more hopeful way of approaching disabilities. So now I would like to move to the preliminary findings of working package 7 on pushback strategies. So the research thus far has shown that there are 4 clusters. Investments in research, legislative reforms, policies, and policy advocacy, then education and awareness building, and finally grassroots organizing and networking. Now, one of the strategies is a key strategy in terms of backlash, the attack of the scientific field that is trying to understand gender inequality. So funding the research that is actually attacked by the backlash is a key pushback strategy. So funding initiatives, but also to improve conceptual framework. So what we saw when we started was that we really needed to work on integrating all these different studies and to see how they talk to each other, especially this intersectional approach, and having disability studies talk to studies about Roma. So this is the first. I am missing one slide. I guess I cut too many slides before. So we have, for example, these Horizon Europe programs by the Commission trying to especially fund this type of research. Then we have reforms, legislative reforms and policies and advocacy. So of course the EU here is also very, very important. It motivates the member states to advance more, but of course in many ways the member states have to do much more than what the EU directives say. So very important is the role of civil society actors and lobbyists for women's rights. We have good practices from Greece, where you have civic empowerment workshops where different types of minority groups like LGBTQA and refugees and disabled people would meet and exchange about their own experiences, but also strategies, how to cope. Then from Ireland, we have funding for projects such as the Populism in the Digital Age, with a particular focus on the impact of democratic principles and gender equality. Now, So that was for the investment, and for the second, the legislative reforms, we have good practices from Sweden. Like, you might have heard about feminist foreign policy. So Sweden has been pioneer in using feminist framework in all the foreign affairs and foreign relations issues. Then we have from Spain, which is really in terms of gender equality very revolutionary lately. There is the organic law on effective equality between women and men, which prohibits discrimination in all spheres of life. Then in Poland, we also have good examples from Poland in terms of counteracting gender-based violence, domestic violence. Then in the area of education, there are good practices are promoting gender inclusive curricula. Like in our universities, we could think of feminizing our syllabus on purpose, giving our students, who are actually 50% women, also some female scholars to read. Sometimes the canon does not allow it, but you can teach the canon and the evolution of the canon. To foster discussions, organize workshops that challenge these discriminatory attitudes and behaviors, empowering marginalized voices. Something that universities do very well lately is to promote inclusive language practices, and last but not least, to engage men and boys in the discussions about gender equality. I personally find this paramount. We have good practices from Germany. In terms of disability, there is an effort to include women with disabilities in politics. In Finland, you have similar efforts for inclusion in the media. In Croatia, you have support of women with disabilities that want to found their own businesses. So there are a lot of examples. Also in the reports you will find more, but I just wanted to showcase a couple. And then grassroots organizing and building alliances and networks in terms of organizing rallies. I mean, now in the digital era, it's also, we have different tools, so these interconnections of different organizations is a bit easier. And you know the Me Too, everybody knows it. The Women March Global, but we have, for example, in the UK, we have the Reclaim the Night, which is against violence, so that women are not scared to walk in the night. And to conclude, I would like to underline that the recent wave of anti-gender equality mobilizations are not just an attack against gender equality. So if, we identify as men, that doesn't mean that it does not concern us. It does, because it's much more than that. It's actually an attack against, first of all, scientific knowledge. We have, legal doctrines. We have a lot of scholarship, and this then is put in question. But also the fundamental values of the EU are put in question. So human rights, freedom, equality, democracy, the rule of law. So it is much more dangerous than we might think. So our argument is that we underline that it is intersectional. So it's not just women and men. There is diversity of women and men. And I highlighted the case of disability, which is one of the most marginalized group of women and men in the EU. And we can, if we acknowledge this social model of disability and that it's something that is created by society, then it can also be changed with the right policies. So investment in research, legislative reforms and policy advocacy, education, which is, there's for researchers and people from the universities, this sounds like very banal, but these are the strategies, and awareness building, but also grassroots organizing. So with an intersectional approach, we could counteract this anti-gender equality backlash, which is also dangerous for our democracies, and to foster more inclusive European societies. So if you want to learn more, we can also send around the PowerPoint. We have a website and dissemination, and you can follow us on Instagram or Twitter. So we look forward to having you as subscribers on our website. And these are just the first preliminary results. So there's going to be, as you see, a lot more coming. So we look forward to discussing with you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Zoe, for your talk. That's a lot of food for thought, and time to open the floor for questions and comments from your side. So if you want to... Okay, I will take a few questions in a round, and please, before asking a question or making a comment, just let us know who you are, where you come from. Dominique. Yes, we need to be speaking in a microphone for each person for the technique.
Does this work?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Dominic Afsharian from the University of Tübingen. I have a quick question for Zoe, because you mentioned in the very end, you mentioned strategies that could work to kind of put these ideas into action in a way. And I wonder where you see the concrete role of the EU in all of this, because I know that the EU has historically developed relatively early compared to other social policy areas, strategies on gender equality. But recently I feel like this has taken a step back, when now, with the exception maybe of the Pay Transparency Directive. And I was wondering where you see concrete options for the EU that the EU could take now to move this ahead, or whether the EU should maybe take a step back and let member states decide, which then I'm wondering whether the political will is actually there. So what's the concrete political potential for this?
We'll collect for now, let's say, 3 questions at a time, or we'll see if there's a question for each of you. Yes, second question here.
Thank you very much. I'm Giulia Giraudo from Scuola Normale Superiore and Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, and I actually wanted to piggyback on what Dominic just asked on the strategies, because I thought very interesting what you presented about the explicit strategies that you see being performed that somehow threaten gender equality, and I think indeed we are looking at a backlash in those terms. But I think we should also acknowledge the issue of indirect backlash, in the sense that I study specifically the post-pandemic recovery plans. And what's very interesting in there is that we had at EU level a lot of reporting about gender inequality and the pandemic. But then if we look at the RRF regulation and National Recovery and Resilience Plan, they are incredibly gender blind. And I do not see in there explicit willingness to exclude gender, a gender perspective, but rather simply a deep priority, like it's not a priority. Simply there are other things that get a priority in the light of, personally, I think a social investment approach that privileges activation. We talked before in the previous panel about that, and I think it's also an aspect that should be taken very much into consideration. And a very, very small note about one of the cases you mentioned as a good practice. You mentioned Sweden and feminist foreign policy, and I'm wondering why you're using the Swedish case, considering that since 2022 they decided to not apply feminist foreign policy anymore with the changing government. Probably the case of Germany could be more interesting, but that's just a small curiosity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we had a third question here. Florian.
Yeah, Florian Tronner from the Brussels Schools of Governance of the Freie Universität Brussels. Thanks to both of you. Interesting talks. I have a question for both of you. Martin, I will start with probably boring question, saying, okay, you have a nice idea, but what is actually the feasibility of these ideas? I think in particular the political preferences and actual capabilities. I mean, political preferences, we have this literature of varieties of capitalism and all the things. So not everybody has the same attitude towards social policy and social norms in Europe. And then there are also budgetary constraints that may be more, I mean, you show all the statistics, may more salient in some of the questions. So that's the first question. Second question to Zoe. You mentioned it's important to include boys and men, and then you also mentioned awareness raising. So I have a teenage boy at home, and I know that some of the teenagers, I mean, they follow this kind of very influential influencers on social media, Andrew Tate and others, who explicitly promote a very conservative model. How, I mean, in your project, do you have, I mean, with social media and awareness raising, do you have an approach there? Do you have recommendations, or what could be done there?
Okay, thank you. Let's start with those three.
Yes.
Zoe, do you want to start?
I will start with the end, because that's the goal, to have a toolkit about how to work with social media. So this is not yet there, but that's one of the deliverables of the project, because social media is one of the biggest problems where you see the backlash and hate speech and aggression and violence. So it's very important, especially for the youth. Then why Sweden? Sweden, because it was a pioneer. I'm fully with you. I will. We have thought of Germany, but this is like for the first round of results, and I think that Sweden was a model. It was something new. Nobody had done it, so it's something that you cannot ignore. And the indirect backlash, yes, often we talk about things, but then it's very like we say in EU studies, it's the written constitution but not the living constitution, so they don't really materialize in practice. And why is that? Because we still have not reached the point where we have the kind of policymakers that would pursue these agendas. So from the research on quotas, for example, and female representation, we know that a very small amount cannot, bring a lot of change. You need not only just women, you need feminist women, you need women who are aware of the problem and want to change it, and also feminist men. Yeah. So that's the problem with the political will, that we have some will, but it's not that powerful. So as long as it's not a priority, because, for example, for the UN, it is much more prominent as a priority. For the EU, I think von der Leyen has also done whatever she could. She has this strategy, talked about stereotypes. So these are important steps. So it was not completely sidelined, but I agree, and I think that it's going to be maybe worse in the future when exactly these kind of parties are becoming stronger and stronger, which are the parties that do not really promote social citizenship and cohesion or gender equality. I think I covered all three questions.
Okay, thank you. Martin?
Okay, unfortunately the person is no longer here, it's just went out. But okay, so feasibility. I think feasibility is a real important issue. But I've learned from a colleague who recently visited Tübingen that it might be good to be an opportunistic utopian. Meaning that if we as academics don't push the boundaries and don't look even at the data, but are basically self-constrain us by certain kind of bubbles and what is feasible, I think we lack something. And perhaps it's also something of age that I can do now where, retirement is close somewhere there. It's like I don't have to publish anymore if I don't want to. So I can do these things. And I think people should do these things, and actually getting us to think about kind of what will happen in 10 or 20 years. A first step might be actually to have this indicator of a European-wide poverty threshold as a European median, actually to benchmark it, because that might have actually an impact in the medium to long term, as have other indicators. I think of the indicator project that Tony Atkinson, Bea Cantillon, and others have done, actually pushed the EU to develop certain kind of policies. And I think if we develop, and also, some of the indicators, the regional variance in terms of income is available, but actually making more use of it. And when we talk about poverty in the European Union and we talk about EU citizens, why do we actually always look at this national poverty, right? So we have really rich countries in the European Union. Let's take a neighboring country, Luxembourg. And, my data was taking into account, purchasing power parities, i.e., this is not that they just have more money, but it takes into account how many tomatoes they can buy. And people in rich countries can buy much more tomatoes than in poor countries. So I think this is something, if we really want to have an ever closer union, and perhaps some people still believe in that model of a federal Europe, a federal Europe in a positive sense, not in a Margaret Thatcher sense. So I think feasibility, pushing for indicators, using these indicators, and actually becoming more honest in the European Union of what poverty means and what inequality means, and how do we, if we have a common entity and jurisdiction, we should actually benchmark against this common median and not against the national ones. That's all. Perhaps the answer, it's you were the opportunistic utopian. Okay.
Good. We have a question here.
Thank you very much. Michael Beitlein, German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Thanks for these thought-provoking presentations. I have a question for Martin. And playing a little bit devil's advocate here, I completely agree with what you said, but I want to just tease out a little bit. So what's the difference between the EU and the member states? So we saw, or as you so eloquently showed, the EU is not living up to social citizenship or what it should be. But as you showed on the subnational level, it's equally and also bad on the members or within the member states. So is the EU not just replicating what the member states are failing at and just says, okay, it's social citizenship, but it's not really? Or is there some additional quality to it? So why should the EU fulfill this goal of social citizenship, which the member states even can't fulfill? Thanks.
Thank you. We have another question here in the back.
Sören Karlsson, Flensburg University, sociologist there, Germany. I have a question in relation to Zoe's presentation. I found it interesting that you mentioned previous rounds of backlash, let's say, to this idea of gender equality. And so in terms of research in relation to your project, I'm wondering, will you maybe look at those previous instances as well, and how, backlash back then, overcome is maybe too strong a word, but was reined in, what kind of happened, and not just politically, but also on a societal level. Activists, organizations, people that became involved, did something, and the outcome of that for this process. Because that could be interesting then for let's say, the part on strategies. And my hunch is that probably, and that's interesting why you mentioned all these organizations and good practices and so on, that this societal level plays a huge role actually in when you look at these previous instances of reining in backlash to gender inequality and how that was, again, maybe not overcome, but kind of dealt with. So I would be interested in whether this is also something you do in terms of research and in comparing these different processes and what happened under which conditions and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a third question for now? Yes, here.
Hello, I have a question for Martin. My name is Sylvia, I'm from the University of Warwick, and it's very interesting because I also study benchmarks, and I'm also from Bulgaria, so I felt a little bit attacked.
Attacked?
Of course, that's a joke. But I wanted to ask you, in terms of, obviously there's a lot of talk about Central and Eastern Europe kind of lagging behind. We're doing good economically, but we're not doing that much well socially. My larger question, it might be not well phrased, but is this despite the EU or because of the EU? Because it's great going to a common benchmark, going towards a common benchmark or idea or standard of EU social policy, but how that's applied in terms of local initiatives, that's something that's completely different. For example, in my country, I study the implications of benchmarking, and sometimes we increase in numbers, so we increase, let's say, unemployed people, or we lift a benchmark, but we're not addressing a systemic inequality. So I hope I addressed it well. That's my question.
Thank you very much. Martin?
Yeah. And I think I missed something in the previous question, but that binds it together. And again, I want to highlight the United States of America, which many of us in this room agree don't have social rights, unequal. Okay? And we criticize the United States for doing that. If you look at the economic differences in the United States, they are stark. You know, compare New York City to Mississippi or Louisiana. Okay? They are not so much different from the differences that we have in the European Union. Now, who are we to, you know, look to the United States across the pond and say, look at them, we are better. Are we better? I mean, they had a longer history of one nation state. But the question is, what does it take to be a nation state, or what does it take to be a union and to have citizenship? That's the point that I want to make. And, you know, can we finance it? That's the question that was raised before. Well, when we criticize the United States, we never ask whether the United States can finance it, right? But also having these huge differences. The question, my main intent was not actually to highlight how certain areas in the European Union lag behind, but my point was that to highlight that within the European Union we assume that the nation states actually have the solidarity to redistribute. And what the regional data shows, that is, you know, imaginative. It's a myth. Right? They might redistribute, but they have hugely unequal outcomes. Now, and some of these, you know, it's a question of people across boundaries are more similar in the outcomes than within nation states, right? In certain kind of areas. And if we look at France, and that might also explain, you know, some of the issues with the yellow vests, you know, Paris. You know, look at the income in Paris or look at the income in the rest of the country. It's very similar to the UK, by the way. So the conceptual point that I wanted to make is we talk about national welfare states. And we talk about the European social union of national welfare states as a holding environment. But this is, you know, we really need to think about what are we talking about? We assume that the nation states actually come up with this one average number, and that's the nation state. But it isn't. And that's something we need to address. And the other thing is a long-term issue, that is, if this entity of the European Union should be developed any further, we really need to think about common benchmarks, right? Because perhaps in the future, people might no longer talk about my country in the way they talk about my country. But perhaps talk about, you know, in the United States, people talk, you know, I'm from Ohio, my state, right? But that is a different kind of conceptualization, perhaps. Or perhaps we should go beyond that and think about what does it mean, especially in border regions. So if in this region, you know, in the Aachen-Maastricht area, this is, you know, where are the boundaries? What are the you can still see it obviously at the license plates. You know, some are more orange than the others and stuff like that. But I still remember that region. You know, when there were, you know, border controls. Me moving from Brunsum to Gangelt across the border, and the German, you know, border guards always checked whether I had some weed with me or not. Took apart my bicycle. This has all changed. And so I think when we really want to look forward to a European Union, ever closer union, we really need to think about beyond the nation states. Now, how we are going to achieve that is the political issue. But that's what I mentioned before, being an opportunistic utopian, in terms of we need to, I think, use as a first step, really use more of these indicators and actually show that. First of all, that also, which also then shows that people in the region that I currently live in are filthy rich. Yeah, they feel poor. They do feel poor, some of them, right? They're Swabians, right? But you know that they need to be aware that even within Germany, they are so turbo rich. And even the poor people in those turbo-rich areas, because it's benchmarked against the median of the turbo-rich, they are quite rich, right? Even the poor. So what does it mean to be poor in, let's call it, let's say Eastern Romania, and in Tübingen, the district or the nuts area in the European Union with the lowest unemployment rate and probably the highest wages? What does it mean? So I think that is conceptually something. And when we talk about poverty in the United States, we never use poverty by states. We use a national poverty, right? Which would then be very similar to using a European-wide one. That's the point.
Zoe, there was one question addressed to you.
Yes, I want to first react to this topic, because how when you say how do we do it, because we are all idealists here and love the EU and want to make it better, deeper and wider. Because we know that it can it is good. There are bad things about the EU and good things about the EU, but overall it's good for us. So evidence-based policy, but how can we establish, if we can speak with facts? Because remember the financial crisis. I am one of the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. So we were told the opposite, right? That the Greeks don't work, they're lazy. But then, when the statistics are not there, or when the journalists do not speak with facts and they only speak with assumptions, which is very connected to the gender stereotypes and racial stereotypes. So when there are so many assumptions and people are just misinformed or ignorant and they keep on reproducing these myths, it's problematic. So where do you start with that? Do we have independent observatories that actually attack governments that use false facts or that do not use facts? Well, how do we do that? And then for me, the most important problem is that you cannot have this EU-level policy goal if you don't have EU-level political integration, if you don't have the movements. And you did have some, with the DM, and you have some efforts, but they crash, against reality, because reality is the system is structured in a way that you cannot compete for votes EU-wide. You have to create national caucus in order to win in Germany and win in Greece and win. So it's not possible, because institutionally we're not there in order to, to push for it. So I think that's where we would have to start to have the incentives to have parties compete for such goals and the counter. So, to have competition on exactly why do we need this social system and why don't we need it, Why do we have to stay with this inequality and have, the Austrians complain that the immigrants come to rob their welfare state and, exploit, the social provisions. So I think that it's deeper. So that's, and now to the comment on the previous rounds of backlash. The short answer is no. But I found the comment very, very, very useful, and thank you, because I think that we would have to. We don't have a historian in the consortium. That's my mistake. But we would have to look maybe, comparatively, or take some cases and see how they fought against it. And perhaps it's much easier today in the digital era where you have it's so fast, the organization nowadays than compared to before. So thank you.
Okay. We'll take a few more minutes for a last round of questions, if there are any. This is your last chance. I have one over here.
My name is Dion Kramer, Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. I have many questions for Martin, but I will leave them for drinks.
Choose one.
I have one question for Zoe, actually, and it has to do with a certain type of discourse that we see, I think, in many member states, but especially in the Netherlands, where I'm from, where I live, is basically that the protection of women is kind of mobilized against, for example, other kind of queer identities, for example. Especially the bathroom discussion is one example of this. Another one is the mobilization of women's rights for certain racist or I would say xenophobic purposes. How do you account for that, perhaps in the project, and is there perhaps a pushback towards that? How do you conceive of that? That's my question. Yeah.
More questions? If not, I'll throw two quick ones myself. One to you, Zoe. How prominent would you say is the intersectionality paradigm among European decision-making circles? My understanding is it's not very much prominent, but you are the expert, so I'm asking you. Martin, did you call yourself a European federalist? Perhaps not loving the EU, but there was a bit of a utopian European federalist. More seriously, do you see, the kind of goals we want to achieve as being able to be achieved through more redistribution from the EU level, or no? Completely different route. Zoe, do you want to start?
About intersectionality, so it is getting more and more into the mainstream. It has advanced very fast. A couple of years ago we didn't talk about it. Now I think that it's much more in the debates. At least in the academic debates you cannot ignore it anymore. But yeah, policymakers, they will need more time, but it is there, and like this acknowledgement of the intersection is coming. So I'm very optimistic about and it's connected to this protection. So that's now the key division within feminists. So our normative theorist is a queer post-colonial theorist. So I think that's a very good start because we had acknowledged already in our proposal that there is this problem and we need to make sure that we understand all perspectives and try to integrate also for the toolkits and everything. I think it's very sad what is going on, that we have to, we have these disagreements because at the end of the day, the whole agenda of equality is suffering. So I hope that by the end of the project that we will send a more positive message about this.
Thank you.
Okay, difficult question. Yes, I consider myself a European federalist because I think if we don't get this European project right, it will become bloody in the European Union, in the area which we call Europe. Furthermore, if we think about further Eastern enlargement, or how we call that, and there are a number of countries there, I think we need to be honest to the public, to the demos, of what that actually would mean. Okay, in terms of redistribution, if we look at the common agricultural policy and so forth, that has not been discussed. I think some people are rushing towards European expansion, or kind of how we call that, for political, military, strategic reasons. However, not necessarily considering what it actually would mean, right? So if Ukraine concretely becomes a member of the European Union, some people might no longer, who are now recipients of EU funds, might no longer get EU funds, and that will be really an issue. Okay, but that is not what that is something that we need to keep in mind overall. My kind of approach is more minimalistic. And yesterday I discussed it with other people, and they said, Martin, you are only for a thin kind of social Europe. Yes, I'm for a thin social Europe of fundamental social rights and the Charter of Fundamental Rights being applied in every nation state or in every region, for one. Second, that we actually need to think about EU transfers and EU minimum wages in the sense of not the way that we have it now, which I think is a really good first step of where we benchmark against the medians of nation states, but actually having floors, right? Just as other federal states also have federal floors which apply. And minimum standards would be a first step. If we look at disability in the European Union, if we actually had disability rights throughout the European Union in terms of accessibility of buildings throughout the European Union, that would be a great first step. So I'm a minimalist, but a minimalist in a sense of minimum rights. That needs to be the first step in this diverse European Union. It's not about convergence, but actually having minimum rights and becoming honest about the huge diversity within nation states and within the Union, and not kind of arguing that, if I would take the poverty data for the state of Baden-Württemberg or the region that I live in, it would be something like 10%. But if we look at the European Union level, so, people in that region might no longer like me now as, say that Martin is a true liberal, that is. but actually understanding how wealthy even on average and poor people are there compared to other people. And not, the question that we need to address also in the long term for the European Union is, can every region be as rich as those regions, or do rich for environmental reasons? And that's also something we don't discuss in the green transition, because the green transition assumes we can continue the way that we are currently working, except that it becomes a bit greener perhaps. But it's not necessarily actually talking about real redistribution, and that those who have might have less, and those who don't have might have more. And these are political, really difficult things. My final point is, and this is also in terms of the European parliamentary election, is we need leadership also discussing about Europe and not my country and my, electorate, but thinking about Europe and what is it? And it's also the electorate of Europe that needs to hold their MEPs to account for European policy. And in some countries, it seems to be that only kind of, let's say, 4 to 8 weeks before the election, we probably, MEPs show up. And then the party programs or the issues are not necessarily European issues, or are European issues. Oh, we want to have a really social Europe. Yeah, we want that. But what does it actually mean? What do you stand for? And I think it's our obligation as voters to actually challenge these when they come with, to some extent, really hollow, empty shells. Who is against the social Europe? You're going to have, no one is against the social Europe. And that is the point that I want to make. So, long-term indicators, if we want to have an ever closer union, we need the first step in terms of social Europe, actually think about same minimum standards. And just on that, perhaps the last note on that, because that is really close to my heart. Really last note is when we had, some call it the bailout, others call it institutional, when the institutions acted, they acted outside the EU framework. Okay? So, in Greece, some people say Greek government could have also did have some different kind of policy, perhaps not spend as much on defense. Some politicians said that, but now people say, well, perhaps it's really good that they spent 5 or 6% on defense. However, what happened is that due to the conditionality and due to the cutbacks that Greek government implemented in the healthcare sector, some people didn't get cancer treatment. And this just can't happen in the European Union that calls itself a European Social Union. Thank you.
Okay. So those have been very, very insightful and lively discussions. Thank you to both of you very, very warmly for coming to Brussels and giving this keynote. Martin, I think you've made the quickest way ever from an airplane to a keynote speech, so bravo. And I would like to invite you all to a reception and continue our discussions with a drink. Thanks.